Hello everyone, today we talk about the affirmation of the Eastern Frankish kingdom and the difficulties in coagulating such political and territorial reality, essentially in the later Carolingian era, which was definitely not very recompositive phase in international history at that point, but that makes, in this sense, the history of East Francia more interesting. Looking naturally at different aspects each, we also studied the history of the various stem duchies that would end up, in fact, coalescing into what we call the German, the Teutonic Kingdom. The latter term, by the way, that came around from the abbeys of Fulda of St. Gall, so at a very sort of elite ecclesiastical level in historiography, into a view that was in some ways different from especially the various provincial lay establishments that had been ruling the various places. Naturally, we made lots of videos also about the 10th century, which is very fascinating in as much as you realize that a figure like Henry the Fowler had been born while the last Carolingians, as properly emperors of the Romans, were reigning. And so in that generational perspective, the recompaction of the Eastern Frankish kingdom is not that far away. By the way, this had never ceased to exist, nor the empire had. We have seen naturally how down the line in German history, the kingdom of the Eastern Franks would have pronounced difficulty in sticking together in a concretely political sense, so regardless of the formalities and the claims. Also today we look at those aspects that, especially in such an early period, tended to increase, if anything, the difficulty in that compaction. Also highlighting how the various post-Carolingian kingdoms, and especially the ones north of the Alps, were essentially the consequence of a relatively, I would stress relatively, random dynamics, meaning that even though there were significant ethnic and territorial divides at different political and social level that were sort of pretty obvious between Gaul and what we call Germany now, the political dynamics that it brought to the fragmentation of the empire was relatively random, right? And just think about the Middle Kingdom, right? That eventually was, in fact, annulled, right? It survived partially just in Provence, in the Rhone Valley, and as a province eventually of the Eastern Frankish kingdom, as in fact this Lotharingia. So it's complex. It's complex also because this is a vast area. And even though it's not as big as later medieval German kingdom, especially after the Ostsiedlung, the latter was already taking place. And in general, there were, in fact, different peoples, as we highlighted, talking about the stem duchies that constituted some robust force overall, regardless of the relative shortcomings of this land. It was by far the least developed in the Carolingian Empire. Now, we've seen in other videos how royal estates and clientales in general were at the heart of Carolingian rule. We even talk about probably the royal abbeys. This was a process mostly concentrated in the Western Frankish kingdom, in the, what would be today's northeast France parts of Benelux. And actually, also the Eastern Frankish kingdom, as it had come to be formed, even before the partition, even probably the nucleation as such, because before it wasn't really a thing. There were different provinces, different peoples that had been subjected, but not quite an entire crown connected to just one chunk of the empire in that area. All right, this is important to stress. In any case, as a consequence of Carolingian rule, and of course also, and this is partially underrated in the wake of the previous, say, independent people's government, and administration, royal estates were unevenly spread across Germania. Naturally, there was a concept of Germany already at the time. Regardless of the floating boundaries, there had been a Germany in classical antiquity that at this point had actually shrunk from the east due to the Slavic settlement. Eventually will re-expand. However, there was indeed a powerful indicator in the spotting of this vast Central European Germanic-speaking region that had been partially Romanized historically, then further colonized by the Franks, and finally fully conquered by the Carolingians, especially with the capitulation of the Saxons. That now acquired, in fact, a more coherent physiognomy, because basically east of the Elbe were the Slavs that had first helped the Franks to clash against the Saxons, now were to fight against basically they both combined. There is the Danube, especially as a highway. There are the Alps naturally in the south that separate the region from Italy, and there is this southeastern waterway that reaches up to God knows where. Really, there were at this time, as you know, some Slavic power reactivations after the destruction of the Avars. Eventually, would be thwarted by the Magyar settlement at the end of the 9th century. Otherwise, it was not such a divide, at least in that moment, between the Western and the Southern Slavs, as we have, as we classify them still today. I talk about those areas, especially we looked at Bulgar, Serbian history, and more. In any case, going back to Germany, in this sense, especially lacked a specific eastern frontier, and especially a stable one against, especially the albeit smaller scale, but still sort of annoying Slavic raids of a real eastern frontier, right? And there were historically important differences. Again, the areas that had been Romanized were historically the more advanced. The ones from which, in fact, we'll see now the Carolingians had been ruling from. And there is all a dimension in the northeast that is less developed, and that, however, paradoxically will witness in the 10th century the rise, especially of Saxon power, testifying to the radical as violently achieved success of the Carolingian conquest and evangelization of Saxon. The royal estates in the Eastern Frankish kingdom were more densely concentrated in the Franconian, Rhine, and Main areas near Kassel and around Regensburg. So essentially what we were saying before, the Rhine, the Danube, the Main, Mogontiacum. Franconia was known like this because it had been controlled by the Franks from quite some time. Since Merovingian times, there had been probably a colonization of these further lands, because originally the Franks at least emerged from just a relatively narrow part, more in the north, compared to what was now called Franconia. There was also a generally more developed area because you have the Rhine, so an important, again, level of urbanization, plus the Main confluence. In it, you have Mainz, Mogontiacum, you have Colonia. Those were the areas where the same Pinit's Arnold things had actually been developing from. We've seen it in the video about the Battle of Territorial. There was naturally Regensburg as the old Ratisbona that was a cornerstone of local administration, would in fact serve especially under the reign of Louis the Pious, and that offered, in a sense, in that also vectorial convergence between the Danube and the Rhine as a path to offer the path towards possible as further intervention from East Francia to West Francia during the Carolingian civil struggles, dynastic struggles, say better, considering what the Franks naturally had largely remained about. We've seen this, in fact, in the video about Louis the Germans' East Francia. there are lots of sort of broader political, even ideological, as we'll see now also with Aachen, like necessities regarding the control of that area in the west that was also more exposed to the Western Frankish offensives and advances. Consider that East Frankreich is the weaker side. And then all logistical, strategical ones. Again, the waterways are quite important. They can serve different purposes. From one side, the Ostsee, following the course of the Danube. From the other, again, an anchoring to the Rhine Valley as well, as a majorly sort of developed area at this point, by the way, had basically witnessed the greatest development in arms and armor production in Europe, while in antiquity it had been Noricum. So there is a very interesting new picture taking shape, obviously also as a consequence of the partial fragmentation of the Carolingian Empire. In Saxony, there were royal estates too. They were positioned mainly along the Hellweg, that was a critical strategic path from Duisburg to Corbeil, thus securing also quite important internal lines to better control the recently subdued, bloodily routed population. Some provinces, of course, were more militarized, which, of course, doesn't mean that they were necessarily more productive, resourceful, actually quite the contrary. And you can argue that Saxony, Thuringia, to an extent, Bavaria had partially taken on that role, that function. Archaeological evidence from the royal estate at Paderborn, excavated in 2014, reveals a fortified complex with a large hall and adjacent church, indicating its role as a central administrative and military hub for Carolingian control over Saxony. We will see in another video better how properly the various hinges of Carolingian political and territorial control actually worked, and the gigantic logistical system of stations, of roads, of local community work, finalized mostly to the provision of the fodrum to the highly, increasingly professional mounted retinues of the Carolingian rulers. This was really, really important. We'll partially see it now. This distribution of royal estates naturally has profoundly influenced Carolingian politics. Charlemagne spent significant time in Germania, but only when required to combat or subdue the Saxons, Bavarians, and Avars. So this eastern frontier function, mostly, and these were all sort of different peoples. Again, the Saxons were the most novel addition, whereas the Duchy of Bavaria had basically been created by the Franks back in the 6th century. The Avars had been basically destroyed as a polity down the course of the Danube, opening to, as we were saying before, also a great deal of options in terms of raiding, of further consolidation, colonization, etc. How many skirmishes actually occurred between the Carolingians and the Bulgarians in between, because there was really a lack of any major power, like the Avars, in spite of their decline, had constituted up to that point in this place. Charlemagne's primary strongholds were west of the Rhine. This was kind of obvious. This lands far east had just been recently acquired, and so there was all a process of further integration, of building that is also underrated for medieval standards. The level of actual colonization, of garrisoning, of occupation, of infrastructural work in an area that, again, was not, as we said before, provided with an enormous surplus, but that in the Frankish Roman formula did succeed. The Rhine had been historically one of the souls of the Carolingian Empire, a part of its backbone, and part of the reason why the Saxons were conquered, for example, was their relentless harassment of the more fertile Rhineland. It was routinely raided. So there were lots of, as we've seen, historical cities of Celto-Roman origin. You had Worms as well, and Aachen, that was the Rome of the north, built in stone, which was sort of a rarity north of the Alps. So Charlemagne belongs to the bloodier, at least in terms of expansion and conquest phase of Eastern Frankish history, which it didn't quite even exist fully already as such, as it was being created as a sort of sphere, right? But was already embryonally there. As Emperor, Charlemagne resided almost solely in Aachen, also for representative purposes. At that point, the place was pacified, so it was an ideally symbolical place where to have also all the comforts, right? These rulers were really captivated with the baths seen in the Roman tradition of the Mediterranean, the vestige, naturally, of the imperial aura in this dominating north, all right, from which the imperium proceeded for a ruler like Charlemagne to conquer the world, accompanied by God, Lord of Battles, as a new David. Louis the Pious also mainly stayed in Aachen. That at that point was a sort of capital, even though it's, say, partially incorrect to call Aachen a capital, and or at least to presume that capitals at the time were truly identified as such and not as some preferential residences. Of course, Aachen was more than a residence in a conceptual fashion, but as we'll see now, given also the eventual fragmentation of the empire and the relative, in fact, minor importance of Aachen compared to many other cities in the same region, highlights the fact that this was some sort of ambitional capital of some sort. In any case, the Frankish world was historically courtly itinerant, which was completely normal, right? Even the Anglo-Saxons developed an earlier centrality of Westminster, so with London as a de facto capital with an early chancery, etc., compared to the Franks that controlled much wider areas, needed to move more, they had more logistical support, greater armies, and so they didn't even properly need a specific center. Louis the Pious frequently visited Ingelheim and Worms from Aachen. He seldom traveled to his eastern lands unless war, especially the rebellions of the younger Louis the German, in fact, as he would become the king of the Eastern Franks later on, necessitated it. So this eastern area was considered as a sort of periphery. Frankfurt am Main was the only eastern city the emperor regularly visited. It's, of course, the fort of the Franks, very strategically located and already an important center at the time. It was also the place where Charles the Bald was born in 823, even though his ambitions, his, say, game of thrones literally would locate him further west, also by the good deeds of his mother. Beyond Aachen, the Rhine-Main region was the core of Louis' authority, and so it's essentially a western one. The emperor's love for hunting often brought him to Salz on the Franconian Saale River, and so there is all geography, of course, of further, courts held at different locations that were also a way to, in between, co-opting the nobility, sort of knowing them better, having an exchange, contractual relation, moving the court in these places, of course, conferred them with a greater prestige. In exchange, the vassals would swear a greater allegiance to the ruler, etc. Recent dendrochronological analysis of timber from the Salz hunting lodge, dated to 812, confirms its construction during Charlemagne's reign, underscoring its strategic importance for royal leisure and regional control. Hunting was also a way to stay in shape, not just as a single individual, but as a body of cavalrymen, as the various satellites that in fact gravitated around the emperor, the kings. Certain estates were really crucial, and just imagine how savagely beautiful Germany would have been at the time. No imperial synod was held in any Germanic bishoprics, however. Right, there was an early church, of course, in Germany, the foundations of which we've also browsed, talking about, in fact, more Rhenish centers of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier, that exemplified that sort of kind of also crossroad kind of vibe with the Roman legacy, the proximity to Gaul, and a properly Germanic soul. However, the latter was yet to properly be one as a whole in this eastern lands. I made some videos about the Heliand, the Muspili, the Ludwigslied that all show throughout the generations the ultimately successful effort to evangelize, to convert the local inhabitants that largely up to that point had remained basically pre-Christian, and or at least they had not, even just in terms of ecclesiastical standards, sparked particularly for great property. It was probably, as you know, a great Carolingian ecclesiastical monastic reform. Made videos about Benedict of Anian, even in areas like Bavaria that had historically been sort of civilized. They had also been Catholic before then. Before some other still Arian peoples back in the day had particularly low standards of ritual property. Gaul was a very different story, even though it was somehow wild, especially compared to in its Atlantic majority to the Mediterranean world. But there was a very different standard, like the Franks had crafted themselves on a very well-developed Gallo-Roman world and church. Right. The regions east of the Rhine thus remain essentially marginal to Carolingian royal power. The bloody Battle of Fontenoy, the biggest showdown in Carolingian warfare, where Lothair was defeated by Louis and Charles, coalesced. Naturally, we're talking about Louis the German, so-called the German, Charles the Bald, made dividing the kingdom among the three brothers, these were the children of Louis the Pious, unavoidable. As I said at the beginning of the video, this is debatable in many ways. I mean, what was actually unavoidable? The fact that the Franks, yes, had maintained the dreadful practice of splitting their monarchic possessions in equal parts among the siblings, and that, Charlemagne and Louis the Pious had been quite lucky in remaining as the only living siblings and their generation. Well, yeah, they absolutely were. So much so that the Carolingian Empire kind of existed, if you want that. But that tells you just by itself how sort of volatile the entire picture really was. It is true that there was a greater crisis, which was political, military, and social alike because of the overexpansion of the Carolingian Empire, and so the necessity of the military, the quite advanced military retinues of the various rulers to, at that point, settle down in a way and or trying to expand from the within, while still vying for a higher recognition within an unavoidably now imperial and at a lower level royal dimension. That is to say, nobody really struggled to destroy the system per se, or at least there were some noblemen who even fought in theory against the crown, but not in the sense that they would have not liked, for example, to arrive there if they could have had. So it was always that countercultural, instrumental factionalism that, if anything, speaks of the obvious, like stronger guy at the top, the sort of the nobility partially resenting and trying to autonomize. The idea that one emperor's son should rule alone, reflecting the monarchy of God and the unity of the indivisible church as much as holy anointed blood of the emperors of the Romans, had failed so far. The institution obviously did not die, because that's a perennial belief, and it was absolutely shared by these rulers from quite a while. They had, as Carolingians themselves, fully inherited and properly embraced all the Merovingian legacy in all kind of imperial, universal, holy matters. The nobility's independent spirit, hidden by Charlemagne's gigantic achievements and never fully subdued, re-emerged forcefully at that point, and is actually the first, if not probably decisively the only factor for which the empire fell apart. The so-called second invasions were just a consequence of that more than a cause. The political system was by that point larger scaled than in the past. We talked a little bit about this in my recent video criticism of the notion that the feudalism did not exist, as kings and generals sort of tend to create this straw man giants that never existed actually. What had actually happened at this point was naturally a radical increase in the size of the military and ever more properly militarized and so tendentially professional clienteles, as a consequence just of the Carolingian recompaction of the Frankish, we can say, empire, as well the establishment of a proper Roman Empire and the further expansion of this all and consolidation of the same. And so personal connections, kinship, and friendship ties that had always been at the basis of a Frankish society at this point had really strengthened, and they had become more oligarchic in nature, more private, and at this point also more landed. The vassalitic beneficiary system, through the historical seniors vassals associations, for the sake of being essentially creating a prepaid system of military service, was this double-edged sword. Like, as long as you would expand, it was sort of green light to seize all this new land. At some point, when the control of these people overstretches, the Franks just find themselves in the hands of what the system has given them to fight, and they can't be simply dislodged from there. There is all properly an administrative, governmental, social, military history of this topic that, if anything, we will discuss better in another video. But imagine all these systems of sworn alliances, noble groups either backing or opposing the crown at this point starting to really gain the upper hand, at least over the broader imperial unit, and causing a great deal of fragmentation, disgregation. Through their interplay, these elements led to the formations, by the way, of new unions and peoples. In fact, the subdivision of the empire, for example, at this kingdom's level, was in part also a consequence of the same mechanism at the highest level. The brutal battle of Fontenoy failed to dissolve the walls of distrust, even among former allies. There wasn't really a clear order anymore, clear goals, a unified policy propagated by this or that ruler that had actually the capacity of rewarding his followers, even at the expenses of some rebellious vassals. Everything was fluid in theory, and in this sense, tendentially unstable. The system was more or less as it had always been working. It's just the forces from the within that were now polarizing towards other directions. Sporadic, ineffective calls for unity were naturally made at a political, ideological level. Again, the concept of the empire, the relative kingdoms, and also the local, provincial, and national, to some point, identities were absolutely there. Right, there were peoples like, the Aquitanians, historically the Burgundians. Well, the latter actually a bit less because they had largely blended into the Franks, but the Alaman, if it would become the Swabians. We made videos about these provinces, and we know that they had actually been Francicized, right? They had not really represented from quite a long time. I don't know, the tribal ethnic confederacies that they had largely been born from. In the Eastern Frankish kingdom, this was even less pronounced because the bigger confederacies had made it elsewhere in southwestern Europe. Germany had maintained some sort of tribal, provincial dimension at most, and that's also why the Franks had basically steamrolled them. Now, the pursuit of greater power was naturally the most persuasive objective in a traditional and imperial community that looked at the kingdom of heaven as the ultimate purpose of existence, right? To essentially save the world by literally paraclitically bringing the same world back to the source through the in battle won Holy Ghost, right? Especially in a militarized world like the one of the Carolingian elites that was largely literate, so it hasn't actually left us much to ponder on, including from a military historical point of view. The few who actually wrote down, such as Nithard, who was a descendant of Saint Charlemagne, who died as an abbot fighting the Vikings in Aquitaine, are all sort of ecclesiologically oriented, like battles are won. He's a witness to Fontenoy. He fought in that, but he actually just speaks of the divine judgment. Paradoxically, it's a truly clerical source like Agnellus of Ravenna, that, however, being sort of more cultured and more literally developed, left us sort of paradoxically as a non-fighting individual that was not even properly from north of the Alps. The sort of more detailed account of the battle properly as a military event. These are the paradoxes of historiography as well. Now, through these noblemen, Louis and Charles publicly demonstrated mutual affection because, as you know, at Strasbourg, before their armies, they affirmed such unity with an oath, right? Louis in the Romance tongue, and Charles in the what is written literally, at least in Latin, in the because these were in fact also written down in vernacular, but presented in Latin. In fact, Teudisca lingua, which would be the German tongue, right? From literally Deutsch, like from Teutonic, from Teuton. That was the identity was in fact already being projected on this broader Germany, as it was essentially being molded from this great cauldron of conquests and resettlement. This is naturally a solemn moment. We will talk about the oaths of Strasbourg at some point in a broader introduction. Strasbourg, in and of itself, the burg of roads, of Straßen, between France, Germany, Italy, in the struggle between brothers that ruled these respective lands, was quite meaningfully expressing this sort of old French and old German culture and tongue and ethnos between the various also clienteles that were, however, quite mixed in that regard. We'll talk more about who properly the Franks were, and definitely the real manpower, sort of greater military and quality came from the Western Frankish world. But aside from the fact that still at the Carolingian court, Germanic was spoken, it would be essentially until the 10th century also in Western Francia. These Western Franks were installed in the East, and as such, obviously, they were proud of their crown and of the power that they wielded there. That, however, in this generation especially, they all hoped to sort of become just the launching pad for reuniting the whole system. The Strasbourg oaths preserved in the 10th century manuscript Nithard's Histories are the earliest written record of Old High German and Old French, highlighting the linguistic diversity within the Carolingian Empire that would trace the later partition. The kingdom's borders could now be viewed as linguistic divides, at least by approximation. Again, there was nothing teleological about that happening, and again, there is a lot in between that for a long time and literally like for a long time in probably also modern and almost, at least in the consequences, contemporary history, even through the birth of something like Benelux, for example, will remain in between and not properly either French or German. A committee of 40 fideles, so the faithful, so this was yet another way to call some vassals, or at least people who had sworn an oath in particular and were loyal to it. Again, we commented on the ambiguity of certain terminology, especially without some more comparative context in this case. But a committee of this 40 fideles per king, tasked with overseeing the territorial division, set the boundaries in November of 842. This is also fascinating because the geographical idea of these expanses was relative. There wasn't such things like maps in a probably geographically projected fashion. Most of the were the so-called itineraria. These men would have crossed these lands throughout the military expeditions for a living. They knew visually in ways that today hardly any person has, like of how these lands would be formed, but they didn't need to picture them on a map. They needed to think them in a political and strategical way, so that eventually, out of respect for his status, they would provide the emperor with the first choice. In who would actually seize what, and the brothers' conflict thus was temporarily settled by the Treaty of Verdun that formalized also the aforementioned division in 843. The precise wording of the oath defining the land division has unfortunately not survived. Only the general outcome, however, is notoriously known. Louis the German received all territories east of the Rhine, including Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. This was very important because you see that there is essentially already a weak area in between that will not be completely manageable by anyone, and the Eastern Franks, at least under this monarchic guidance as a sum of different establishments, can maintain at least the upper hand on the more civilized western part of Germany. Charles the Bald took the west, which was, as a whole, the most powerful part of the empire, and Lothair received the Middle Kingdom, including Aachen and Rome. So essentially the Italic kingdom that was the most important institutionally wise, in as much it conferred the imperial title. In fact, Lothair was emperor. And this stripe of land went from Switzerland to the North Sea that contained Aachen. And so the two poles of the empire, so to maintain the sort of latitudinal unity in this axiom. It was also cosmological in many ways of imperial attainment. And that, however, posed de facto Lothair, mostly in an Italic context, that was the only one that could truly wage some consistent power from. Epigraphic evidence from a 843 charter issued at Speyer confirms Louis the German's immediate consolidation of power in East Francia, by the way, with the city of Speyer serving as a key administrative center. In the Franconian era, under the Salians, that will become, by the way, a very important center of probably imperial identity, in as much as many rulers would be buried there. Also, throughout all sort of medieval, the German Middle Ages, it would be replete with that kind of important symbolism or resting place of the Holy Roman Emperors, some of the Holy Roman Emperors. The three kings pledged brotherly love, peace, and friendship to each other. Naturally, all this was in tatters, really. The brothers sought to tackle their major challenges together, committing to regular meetings. However, they were also just pushed by the relative establishments to take advantage of any weakness of their brothers. They issued joint statements and decrees on ecclesiastical and secular governance that could sort of bolster a bit also the general prestige of the Carolingian dynasty as imperial blood. So they had wanted the division, but still they wanted to maintain the notion that, of course, as a clan, they were, of course, at the top of any other. This was very Frankish and very valuable, by the way, and that's also in part why the empire sort of survived. Not only naturally. At this point, there were also external issues, especially in the far north, that was a bit neglected, as we've seen in this case. The Vikings, for example, were harassing the North Sea shores. There were problems of crime. Different lords had started sort of abusing of their power, usurping public rights, etc. Besides, there was also a problem of refugees. There were lots of peoples in and around the empire that were, say, living in essentially a war zone, we could say, and or that were displaced for other political, social reasons, including the aforementioned ones, so just the Viking incursions, but also the usurpation of certain properties, the dispossession from certain lands, the harsh worsening of some living conditions. And so this was all a bit also the part of the consequence of the same Carolingian conquest that dragged on as the system was so big that it still had to find a stable balance. Naturally, reality fell short of the Carolingian declarations. When facing external threats like Vikings, Saracens, Slavs, and Magyars, each king was left to fend for himself. That's also what paradoxically fosters that monarchic regional reality in a political and territorial sense. If you have to defend, every kingdom was was actually infested by all of these threats. Really, Vikings, Saracens, Slavs, and Magyars hit pretty much everywhere. France, Germany, Italy. However, each one had their own sort of preferential one. The Vikings, especially in France at this point, the Magyars later on, especially in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, and the Saracens in Italy. Except the Slavs in France. No, we don't hear of those. But, among the Vikings, there would be Slavs. So let's count those as well. In a broader political sense, however, not, of course. Now, the Carolingians rarely supported one another. On the contrary, as it is notorious, they even threw sometimes these peoples against one another, but just like East and West had done within the Roman Empire during the migration era. Some Saxons occasionally assisted Charles the Bald, as in 860 and 863. For example, an 862 capitulary from Koblenz, which is in the Eastern Frankish lands, and a quite strategic place, details Charles the Bald's request for Saxon cavalry to counter Viking raids, specifying their obligation to provide 50 mounted warriors. Now, this is interesting because it's as if from Gaul, as we were explaining before, Charles the Bald maintained a bit more of an imperial stature. Right? He would eventually become Charles II in exchange for essentially the neutrality especially of Italy, because he entered the land just eventually to be crowned, but not to maintain the country, because as you know, the Eastern Franks had something to say. They descended in Italy. There was a major battle, even bigger than Fontenoy, to happen in the Po Valley, but they stopped before the massacre would start, because they said, okay, get your crown and go back to Gaul, and nobody touches Italy, Rome. And this is already a very late stage of, in fact, the very last Carolingian imperial power. But because you have essentially This is in the 70s. In 888, you have Charles III, Charles the Fat, that dies, and he's the last Carolingian emperor, not ruler, because that would continue at least in Western Francia. However, as you understand, things were not particularly rosy. For a time, the Carolingian monarchs' meetings upheld the facade of a unified Carolingian kingship. But the mere fact that they had to convene from different lands and to agree on all these issues through such formal acts was by itself like the proof of the fragmentation of the system. About 100 such gatherings are recorded for the period. However, the successive mutually recognized treaties hastened the independent development of the kingdoms rather than curbing it. In other words, they were sharing further the empire by attentively stabilizing their own respective spheres of influence. That, again, makes a lot of sense, and it is exactly what you can even positively see as the final settlement of, at this point, like the late Carolingian towards a post-Carolingian Europe. As the century advanced, these meetings unsurprisingly grew less frequent. Lothair never entirely relinquished his dream of restoring the empire's former greatness, because he was truly the emperor of the Romans. He ruled from Italy and he controlled Aachen, but he could not really establish a foothold. Divisions, the oil fields of the Franks laid in the north, mostly in Gaul. And from Italy, there wasn't much that Lothair could do simply to dislodge both, especially equalized East and West Frankish powers, per se. The situation was fluid enough. This is mostly a political reason. It's not like, World War I scenarios of attritional warfare between industrial powers. So that the clan, the imperial clan itself, through dynastic ties, could at some point even come to reunite everything. I mean, Charles III did all of this, and this was not really anew in Frankish history. Think about Dagobert. It was always the same story. If all your siblings and their heirs die, which also tended to happen quite oddly and as violently in Frankish history, exactly for this inheritance splits, you could sort of get everything back in your hands, right? And but without too much of an effective power, at least in the case of Charles III, right? Differently from, of course, the time of Charlemagne, of Louis the Pious, who all had, as you know, brothers who were meant to succeed at least to power, and even before them, as the more important heirs. Lothair's brother Louis was unwilling to accept the Treaty of Verdun's terms, even given that there was already this proclivity of the Eastern Franks to essentially consider Lotharingia as their own, without mentioning Louis's opportunity to re-enter Gaul and to subjugate rebellions in that region. Charles, by the way, felt similarly, because he was sort of more content, of course, of his Gallic partition, but he, as a consequence, felt like it would be easy to get all the rest at some point. In fact, he would get at least the imperial title, as we explained. Until 840-43, Lothair, as emperor, mainly resided in Italy, especially in the north, in Pavia. That was the capital of the Longobard kingdom. Afterward, he stayed almost exclusively north of the Alps, primarily around Aachen, his main stronghold, that, as we've seen, however, was relatively more threatened, and in fact, like at the head of a fundamentally more the most incoherent of these partitions, right? Because at least the Italic kingdom in the south was not just well enucleated by geography, but it was recognized properly historically as a state. It had a tradition in that direction. Lotharingia, which took the name after these partitions of Lothar, then there's Lothar II, etc. It's not really something. It did not overlap with any national, ethnic, sort of solidly political, cultural boundary of sort, and it was thus destined also to vanish. And it was essentially a bit of a counter on its own. It ended up, because of this paradox, to become something on its own. But it wouldn't give a true life to an alternative nation like France or Germany, right? And this is kind of obvious. We've seen it throughout, I don't know, the Middle Ages, the history of the Burgundian states, the tormented boundaries between France and Germany. At least, well, they weren't even so tormented to a degree until Louis XIV. More or less, the settlements were unchanged. But it was naturally difficult to even maintain a power within these boundaries to begin with. Lothair's gradualist approach, we could say, intended to let the 841 defeat fade, achieved little. He essentially hoped that by recognizing his brothers and gradually wedging between them, he would simply sort of absorb them back again as sole graded ruler, of whom his siblings were just some sort of vassals and or subordinates. In 844, Pope Gregory IV named Drogo Archbishop of Metz. Remember that this was also quite ancestrally a Carolingian place, Arnulf of Metz, hence the Arnulfins, Pipinids had a specific symbol. Really named this guy as papal vicar for the entire Frankish kingdom, which was a clear attempt to weaken the Treaty of Verdun, because by recognizing the entire Frankish kingdom, not empire, by the way, they're two different things, it would basically deny the separation of the latter. This is important because, as you know, the Franks had, up to Charlemagne, had ruled over what was a de facto empire, but that stood out as essentially the Frankish kingdom lording over other peoples like the Alemanni, the Bavarians, the Aquitanians, the Burgundians, and so on. That kingdom had never been truly parceled out. At least the Treaty of Verdun had done so by essentially splitting the realm between Neustria and Austrasia that had historically been the two distinct areas of the Frankish kingdom, right? And that therefore seemed kind of also Solomonically apt, right, ready for that kind of at least sphere of influence on what was proudly maintained as a singular Frankish kingdom. Besides, the Lotharingia run in the midst of that as well, so it was a tripartition of the Frankish kingdom, not a bipartition, not in fact quite Verdun had not separated along exactly the two the two areas as well. So the Pope here helps Lothair in making a broader international statement and recognizing at least a papal vicariate for a united Frankish kingdom. Now, the reason why the church was important among the other things is that notoriously Charlemagne and Louis the Pious, that were sort of the more enlightened of the Carolingian rulers, and or at least the ones that found themselves in the condition of reasoning at a higher level because of the unity of their dominion, had enormously invested in ecclesiastical administration, because, as we very well know, Frankish public culture is purely private. All right, there isn't a state north of the Alps. It had somehow never existed in properly in a Romano-Germanic sense. At least it depends on what you mean by state. But everything was basically a huge private clientele system. So yes, there was a state of some sort, and the church, in fact, was the best element of that. It was not, even though it was formed by members that were straight from the same families of warriors, and sometimes they were themselves part of that, as bishops and abbots were called before. They, however, could not really split the church as a private possession. Besides, historically, the early Carolingians had successfully imported an enormous lot of Roman Mediterranean culture, sense of state, right administration, literacy, and so the church was the best candidate to fill a bit that void of statal absence, which ultimately failed to prop up, in fact, a functional lay power, because the Carolingian Empire disgregated, but however, at least maintained a quite thick and robust net of episcopal and monastic communities that would be the connective tissue of post-Carolingian Europe, and made multiple videos on that. And so attentively, Pope Gregory IV's appointment of Drogo, Archbishop of Metz, as papal vicar for the entire Frankish kingdom, was a way to sort of reconsolidate that higher northern force that had wielded the empire over these other lands. A letter from Pope Gregory IV to Drogo, dated in 844, you understand also how close to the Treaty of Verdun and how sort of a response to that it was, specifies his role as vicar to oversee ecclesiastical unity across the Frankish realms. This is preserved in the Codex Vaticanus. Of course, it served different purposes. It's obvious that the Roman Church had always had a pretty unitary and direct control over, for example, the evangelization of Central Europe. That had historically been a great, in fact, unitary control of these endeavors between Rome and even, the Celtic, the Anglo-Saxon missionaries. That was especially the case for what would become Germany. Think about Saint Boniface. Think about the obvious unity and hierarchy in the establishment of a Roman ecclesiastical administration, even before, of course, the Gregorian reforms and the birth of the papal monarchy. I also made a video explaining what was happening in Rome at the time of, if anything, Charles III, which is likely later here, a few decades, but it gives you an idea of how, of course, the Eastern and the Western Franks had factions in Rome sort of struggling against one another to have their own papal candidate elected, and therefore also requiring to the current pontiff like certain particular recognitions and favors. It was an incredibly complicated situation, but witnessing to the deep intertwinement of Europe already at that point. Besides, Gregory IV's action proved ineffective, and after Drogo's death in 855, it was not even repeated. So it was understood that this general attempt, at least to maintain an ecclesiastical unity of the Frankish kingdom, did not even properly mirror the actual power ratios, and the church would go on its own way. There was a few that could be done properly about lay power. Lothair tried unsuccessfully to sow discord between his brothers, which was also relatively easy considering that, as we explained, there was aside from this Lotharingian, at some point almost nominal reality in between, that was secluded from the Italic kingdom, the Eastern and Western Franks were looking at one another to reunite power, especially Eastern Franks to sabotage the Western Frankish royal policy and attemptively, in fact, hegemonizing the same Western kingdom and rising into a unitary transalpine power. In fact, there wasn't, as we just explained, even a veritable frontier between the two, East and West Francia. So it's interesting because they were really part of the same system. Again, we tend to reason more in terms of France or Germany, but at the time, especially the Carolingians, didn't see this in that way, without mentioning that, of course, the compaction, especially of Germany, was pretty loose. And so, as we've seen, there could be different alignments, including the Saxons sort of responding to the call of the Western Frankish ruler, as if it was just a part of East Francia that Charles the Bald could obtain the loyalty to, as opposed to his brother. although Charles and Louis' relationship did turn hostile at some point, with Louis warring against Charles in particular, this did not bolster Lothair's power at all. Instead, the Carolingian brothers' mutual animosity encouraged the Vikings to escalate further attacks on the Frankish kingdoms, particularly Lothair's lands. And so the northern ones, because as we've seen, these were sort of weaker and looser. And so the Norse understood that was a easier target. In fact, notoriously, the Vikings repeatedly burned Dorestad, that was a vital port and trading hub on the Lower Rhine. We're essentially in the Netherlands, right? And this will also enhance part of the autonomization of those lands that were quite depressed at the time and really, therefore, also less important. So they had to cope with the Vikings on their own terms. At some point, the Frisians even sided with the Vikings, in part, but civilization triumphed in a way. But, for example, Dorestad was destroyed in 847, and Rorik, the Viking, permanently occupied it in 850 as well. Eventually, Rorik will be dislodged, and we think he's literally the same guy that gave birth to the Ruric dynasty of the Varangian Rus, right? So it's interesting to see from the north conversion towards the pole how sort of easy longitudinally it was to move across the North and the Baltic seas, searching for these opportunities. But it gives you also a dimension of how abandoned certain peripheral provinces were. It's not like the Carolingian rulers, by the way, were just sitting ducks, right? It was actually a pretty relentless effort, and we also tend not to recognize it, even a successful policy, regardless of the broader, say, attacks that followed in some richer lands, especially in Gaul. The reason why the Vikings would eventually turn to England is that the Western Franks at some point did solidify and were sort of, even in a moment of great political fragmentation, capable of moving the invaders towards some easier, softer targets, although sort of also poorer ones. Archaeological findings at Dorestad, including charred remains of wooden structures dated to 847, confirm the extent of Viking destruction, by the way. It's not like there was much, but the clashes could be really furious. The emperor could no longer suppress the Norse. This was an important theological aspect of imperial authority. If you do not wield military power, where's your Holy Ghost, right? What kind of power has God conferred on you? And that had been a huge deal, especially considering the achievements of Charlemagne that had come to almost threaten the entire Denmark, right? So just for pointing out the scale of grandeur that was lost in the span of a few decades, really. So this seemed, even from a psychological point of view, from the side of people who hadn't been raised properly in the utter mythology of imperial power and military glory, etc., like devastating. And surely the temper of the time, the spirit of the time, was bending toward that direction. There is, as well as a consequence, I made some videos about Odo of Cluny, the general reason why, for example, the Clunia confraternity properly happened, and what was there to recover from that word, why that new moral attitude, why that new form of organization of the monastic space. It had deeply to do with that issue of imperial disgregation, whereby the monastery, as the reflection of the heavenly Jerusalem on earth, has to become the model of the revivifying model for all humanity, far from a seclusive community, something that had to really inspire even the protectors of the same communities in the same monastery. That's also the case for Odo of Cluny's own biography of Gerald of Aurillac, that it represents in the darkest hours of the 10th century an example of Saint Lady, which is a big deal because it naturally aligns with incredibly traditional ideas of power wielding, and the case of the warriors as called even to technically overlap by some degree with the sacerdotal one, which in Christendom at least had been lost to the extent in which the empire and church had cooperatively separated for the sake of better functionality. But it's not like individual rulers could or would not had that. This is very important, because the emperor did claim such a level of holiness, and the same papacy had a temporal power. So the two things, we explain it very much in the videos about the Renovatio Imperii, deeply overlapped. In any case, Lothair's authority also weakened in his southern territories. Provence, that had historically been assigned to Italy, at least in the broader partition of this middle kingdom, remained peripheral to Lothair's power. This is something of a recurrence here in Holy Roman Imperial history. Also, Lothair did really not do much to counter Saracen attacks that famously even targeted Rome, looting the apostles' tombs. That was one of the also the worst moments in the history of mankind. The looting of the relics of St. Peter and St. Paul's basilicas prompted an enormous reaction in administrative and spiritual terms from the Carolingian rulers. If you actually look at how they still, like, this is true also at the time of Louis II. Actually, the Italic kingdom was pretty functional. All these kingdoms were actually functional to a degree. And there is some capacity of Lothair, for example, to rush to Italy and to launch a campaign against the Muslims. At Pavia, he met his son Louis II, where in April, May 847. The problem was, as often happens as far as moments of temporary Western crisis are concerned, it's not much the external threat the problem. We said it even before. But what can happen internally if one side sort of is too committed towards external, right? It's just like, I don't know, when the Turks attacked the Ottomans. Were the Ottomans, more powerful than Christian Europe? Hell no, right? If Christian Europe had been simply united in taking out the Turk, that would have happened in the span of a generation, but it would have not even heard of the Ottoman Empire in principle. The issue, however, is more complex than it seems. In fact, when you are looking at, for example, in this case, the possibility of Charles the Bald to plot against Lothair to march into Italy, as he was involved in a southern expedition along the peninsula. Given that also, as we've seen, the administrative center of the Italic kingdom was Pavia, where, as we've seen, also the Italic crown, and thus the propedeutic one for the conditio sine qua non for the Holy Roman Imperial one in the urbs, was to be seized. And all this was happening a few years after Verdun. So in a moment of sort of recent peace agreements, this prompted the Saint Lothair to hurry back from the front against the Muslims in February of the same year. Besides, the situation in southern Italy was a bit confused. There were the Byzantines, there were the Longobards still. So it's mostly, at that point, it was some sort of competition against the Byzantine Empire more than a Saracen threat per se. If anything, those who had attacked Rome were pirates rather than sort of a terrestrial force capable of threatening the Italic kingdom as such. And so we'll see, if anything, better in other videos. We will gradually take care of all of Europe. I made some videos about, for example, the Carolingian government of Italy from a strategic point of view, the frontiers of the empire, in multiple instances, so we explained a bit what was going on. Lothair invested some effort in planning a grand alliance with Pope Leo IV. In fact, we just mentioned them, the Dukes of Benevent and Naples, that were especially like the former, like the main Longobard power left in the south, in this sort of aura of ambiguity, given that the Italic kingdom reflected the Longobard kingdom, but let's say the capacity of the Carolingians to control directly southern Italy, to march in Benevent even, and retaining control of that was pretty difficult. also because the southern Italian hinterland is all pretty rough and mountainous. Naples, if anything, was more showing the Byzantines how far they could reach, just as the alliance that Lothair achieved with the Doge of Venice. The latter as well was since the death of Pippin of Italy, so the uncle of these children. Pippin had to literally become the heir of Charlemagne. He had to become the following emperor, but he died of malaria, the siege of the Venetian lagoons that were technically a part of the Byzantine Empire, but now were essentially negotiating with the Western Empire, as it was definitely when I recently made a video explaining a bit the concept of Western Empire with Charlemagne's crowning on top of all the ones I've made, as a partner for Venice, and so winning even some sort of autonomy. As you know, Venice will not be part of the Holy Roman Empire ever, but still, being an Italian power and fully integrated into the system, regardless of its lagoon position. So that was continuing what we explained in the aforementioned video about Charlemagne's crowning, that essential takeover of what had been the broader Italian space, together with Rome, against the Byzantines, which was something looming since the times of Clovis, and even prompting in great part Justinian's reconquest of the West to stamp the Frankish conquest of Italy and Rome. In 847, the Emperor Lothair summoned a synod in Francia, as the Latin says, which requires bishops to provide military aid to the Italians, and crucially decided to impose a special tax across Lothair's kingdom to fund defenses around St. Peter's in Rome. This is, as we were saying before, a very important moment, because the Urbs has been, at least in the outskirts, because the basilicas were outside of the city historic, so outside of the Aurelian walls, and that's why the Saracens had managed to sack them. And so what you see today also when you go to the Vatican are the so-called Leonine walls, which were erected exactly at this point. The name is after the Pope of the time, Leo IV, that essentially built this defense around St. Peter through probably the Carolingian Italic administration's help. If you read the capitularies of the era, you realize how much the Carolingians really cared and how sort of military-minded they were, and also in terms of territorial control, maintaining especially the bridges, the major communications, like intact, like well preserved, which obviously the communities had to contribute to as well. And since Lothair is the emperor, he basically, given that, of course, Rome herself has been struck, which was something that definitely had not helped his, general prestige, but still prompts in Francia, so in the north of the Alps, such help from his brothers, basically, and of course the communities of those kingdoms. They could simply say, well, for Rome, we will really help. A Vatican archive document from 847 records the synod's decree mandating each bishopric to contribute 100 silver denarii annually for Rome's fortifications, which is a big deal, frankly. And it does show how concrete the effort really was, and how in the 9th century, even in a moment of relative, let's say, unity of the empire, how costly it was to bolster such infrastructures, especially fortifications in stone. And again, the Italians actually had plenty of that material, and castellation will essentially start from the same area around Rome, historically in the Middle Ages, in somehow like the mid, the first half of the 10th century, whereas it will arrive as far as Baltic Germany in the mid 12th century. So it's really, it tells you, even across the centuries, how different, how sort of differently developed these areas really were, and how, of course, like Rome could also benefit of local resources, but there had to be, in order to create a new fortification encompassing properly the perimeter of St. Peter, like an enormous effort of European scale. Meanwhile, all authority in Italy shifted to Lothair's eldest son, Louis II, soon crowned emperor by Leo XIV in 850. And still at that point, Louis II is an incredibly fascinating ruler, and one that kept things working in Italy. And again, that's why we absolutely must talk about him at some point. Nevertheless, still within, of course, this regional reality, in a time in which the game that his father's generation could play, hoping to reunite the world, was not really to be played. Even Charles III nominally reunited the world, but didn't succeed in, of course, controlling the world. And as you know, power shifted also towards other areas, including the East, for example. Think about Arnulf of Carinthia, and again, how the Eastern Frankish kingdom did matter. Under the same Pope, Leo IV, the papacy began to break free from Frankish control. Especially under Louis the Pious, you can argue that the Carolingian control of the papal election had been very strong. There were some specific connections between the papacy and the empire that basically framed the former as a vassal of the latter. And so a recognition of divine rule even to the emperor as such, to which the priest, the highest priest, the sacerdotal case, was subordinated and just mostly fighting in a hierarchically subordinated position to bolster the power of. At this point, of course, the relations, these are the same issues, as you understand, that would trigger the investiture controversy later on, because this had begun since ever, even between the Pope and the Franks, that had very early connections. You can argue that Pippin the Short already had some relative perplexity on how to operate in Italy, and especially in front of the patrimonium of St. Peter. At this point, naturally, as Carolingian imperial power was waning, and even within the same Italy, with a functional ruler like Louis II, there was a lay authority. Like, the papacy could act a bit as a thing on its own. I made multiple videos explaining the very gradual expansion of the Patrimonium Sancti Petri, that, however, is dwarfed by the spiritual hegemony of the Pope over Europe to begin with. So it's not much a matter of sort of territorial power in the case of the church in particular, but something much greater that obviously at this point intertwined with the papal authority that had always been there to actually crown and recognize the emperor, which was technically the only way that could happen. And it's interesting that, in fact, the Carolingians, with all their previous power, also kind of allowed this, as much as the fact that they had to come to Rome to be crowned. This gives you a dimension of how magnetically polarizing, of course, Rome was for any power around, how in the later centuries everybody would follow the same path, even though the Italian expedition was costly and dangerous and would even oblige the Transalpine rulers to leave their kingdoms, often also in revolt, given that also these crownings were not always consensual, so there was an entire war, excommunications, etc. So we have seen this better, especially for the higher Middle Ages. Nevertheless, the Eastern Frankish kingdom's unity in this period can be argued having rested solely on the king's person. This is very relevant even at a deeper theological level, because, again, a Carolingian ruler wouldn't see in these partitions of the empire much of a national meaning that was at least sort of overarching the entire narrative. They reasoned by universal Catholic standards. They didn't see anything but the empire. And the fact that, especially as Carolingians, they were a chosen race of the Holy Anointed, recognized by God and his church as the legitimate rulers of the world in ways that we will unfortunately never fully know, like what was like being a 9th century Carolingian. Imagine like your father's been Louis the Pious, your grandfather's been Charlemagne. Think just how sort of personally impacting something like this is, the expectations, the lifestyle. I made multiple videos about this era. This is an incredibly important era in the history of Europe for properly molding. It's a moment of transition in a way towards something even not necessarily less traditional per se, but in a way that would have, a few centuries before, were still basically like the Western Romans ruling. The Germans had come out, especially in the case of the Franks, just from the forest in relatively recent time. The level of grandeur to which these peoples had risen, and the traditional practices, especially in terms of Männerbunde and the broader sense of how to practically achieve world domination, were so strongly there in ways that are practically impossible to describe. And unfortunately, we tend to see this mostly just in, this is like the chunk that had to become Germany, right? They didn't really care about this. They didn't really see it above the bigger picture. We'll explain this better also through ecclesiology, through other sort of indicators. The Eastern Frankish army consisted of contingents from distinct peoples that had remained such just up to that point. The fact that they were historically Germanic is, yes, they were close to one another, relatively close at the regional level, but this was not particularly different from how there could be a broader Romance identity. Yes, there kind of was, but paradoxically, the Germans had sort of less of that because they exactly had never had like a more overarching identity. And again, a Teutonic one was just taking place today. What's the at this point? What's the limit there? Also with the Norse or with even those Germanized elements in some other areas that are already, for example, under Frankish control from centuries. So it's sort of complicated. When the court was called by the Eastern Frankish king, nobles appeared largely still in tribal groups based on the stem duchies. Yes, they were an aristocratic establishment. They were, especially in the 9th century. Think about the Stellinger revolt, basically crushing the other social estates for good, by the way, in German history, under their heels or their horses' hooves. But there was still a lot of provincial brutality in their mentality and general primitive approaches to politics and warfare. The areas they inhabited governed by their own ethnic laws at probably a provincial level, distinguished from one another. Say the Saxons different from the Alemanni, the Bavarians different from the same Franks, from the same Thuringians, were typically seen as their own patria, because this is how it's translated by the Latin sources of the time, by the same Eastern Frankish, as we've seen also monks, etc. So the land of the fathers, the Vaterland, right? The idea that there is not just merely a nation, it's so somewhere where you have been born by accident as part of a broader empire. It's literally the places where your own fathers, say, memorially stemmed from, and that you also lived in, right? And so there was an incredibly courageous attachment to that kind of local. By the way, this was essentially a mob, right? The aristocracy monopolized. They were resisting, say, some more monarchic imposition, but they were essentially imposing themselves in the same way at a smaller scale in their own abodes. That's why essentially like freemen were going under and even allied with the slaves, trying to break the system, and failed, by the way. And this courageousness is of the same bloody nature that brought the Saxons to resist for decades of massacres, of deportations, of further rebellions and unyielding defiance. And they lost, but they also won in the sense that they became, in fact, the emperors of the following generations. So evidently, again, Frankish Roman system, I made a video about this, was incredibly brutal, incredibly violent, but also extremely efficient and extremely effective at the same time. The idea of the entire Eastern Frankish kingdom as the supreme patria for all peoples remained embryonic. It was understood being there. It was essentially conceptualized, as we've seen, by the most important monastic centers of the land. But still, in fact, in a more royally functional direction, which naturally was pursued by the greater sort of bishoprics and and monasteries whose scriptoria were naturally the places of origin of such formulations. That, however, ended up becoming exactly the German nation as we understand it today, is still in its federal nature, for example. That is a direct consequence also of that more sort of provincial autonomy. Neither the lay nobility nor the clergy felt tied to the oaths of Strasbourg, the Treaty of Verdun, for example. This is very interesting. They were partly participating into that, but the idea that there would be some boundary there that was defined is erroneous, right? Well, even those who had sworn those oaths and sort of testified to witness to those agreements intended them mostly as our leader, all right, has brokered this deal, and so now we follow our leader for such, but not because there is a territory that sort of pre-exists that we identify with. All right, if that existed, it was much smaller than the Eastern Frankish kingdom. And so really how much do the Frisians have in common with the Bavarians, right? Especially, I don't know, southeast of the Alps, places like Carinthia. Again, and this is a very important question, because up to the modern age, literally the Netherlands seceded from the whole Roman Empire, and so from the German kingdom. But that gives you, in fact, an idea of how sort of debatable even certain identities remained, at least this fringe realities, if we pick obviously these extremes, right? Obviously, there still is some kind of broader identity, even if not overlapping with properly the sort of nation-statal one that of the last couple of centuries. These Eastern Frankish aristocrats, unlike, by the way, the Western Frankish nobility after the Treaty of Coulenc in 843, wouldn't form a true union, right? The Western Frankish kingdom at some point seemed to fall apart more than any other, because it seemed like the king was really abandoned to the vastity of this deeply populated and well entrenched sort of seigneurial realities all across the country, the Atlantic plains. But the truth is that the vassalitic beneficiary system had created that, and that actually there was so much resource in Gaul that temporarily, yes, these lords could be autonomous, but they would have much more surplus historically to agglutinate themselves and to create great principalities in France, including the one of the Ile-de-France, from where the Capetians would eventually take over the rest, and following basically in the footsteps of the Frankish imperial grandeur of the north, dominating over the other peoples around. So actually the same identical pattern taking place yet again in French history. Also, for those people who say, well, but you can't say that there is something about, I don't know, France in particular in Clovis. Well, there actually is, and quite powerfully, and you can't say since something is not 100% then it did not exist. It's silly, all right, there is an overwhelming continuity with those foundations, and they were mostly, in fact, in Western France, that, in fact, had, as the Treaty of Coulon, for example, showed, this sort of displayed this greater identity. The treaty preserved in an 843 manuscript from Tours formalized essentially a contractual agreement between Charles the Bald and his nobles, granting them hereditary rights over their lands in exchange for loyalty. This is what also happens with the Capitole of Quercy-sur-Oise, which is it's the sanctions and inheritance, also the major fiefs, right, or the major beneficia, will be complemented with the Edictum de Beneficiis, a Constitutio de Feudis by Conrad II in the 11th century from Italy, about the inheritance of the smaller fiefs that were needed, to receive, in that sense, the support from the smaller vassals. Naturally, in a very different picture. There was a fear, a further fragmentation that, however, held the systems together. This happened also in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, and it was properly understood in the 10th century, when at some point the Magyars, that had entered Germany mostly because the nobility had let them in to cross their lands without too many troubles, to reach places like the same West Francia or wherever, at some point said, well, you know what, this is not really that convenient anymore, and therefore let's simply try not to, let's say, to disintegrate the system further, because there was a risk of even certain provincial entities to collapse in the process. And so it's all very complicated to an extent, but when you get the gist of at least the basics and how the system maintained itself in spite of all these shatterings, without, by the way, any previous glue, and without thus even the expectation that anything should have gone toward that direction, you realize how effective the entire imperial formula really was. I mean, at least in imperial, one intended in an imperial Catholic sense, and so shared by people who, at large, were incredibly aware, actually, of this broader purpose, like what had happened. We tend to, in fact, this has been done for the Roman Empire, but also the Carolingian one has been described maybe too many sort of land exploitation, distribution, or kind of this stuff. But at the end of the day, this system worked because there were people, and it sort of allowed for the continuity of an imperial legacy, because the people who had built it were incredibly proud of what they had achieved. And it was something extraordinary. Again, we talked about this, again, just recently in the video about Charlemagne, and probably what the Roman Empire presaged by Clovis' victory in Gaul and fulfilled by Charlemagne's triumph in Italy. This is not a small thing. This is not something that happens by chance, or that had not been envisaged before in the previous centuries, or that was really an accident of history. This stuff happened because there was a design to achieve that, because Rome had to be provided with an empire once again, because the Franks truly believed to be God's chosen people, because the Carolingians truly believed, just like the Merovingians, to be the chosen race of divine conquerors, and because the entire system was clothed with an immense sense of holy anointing as much as the blood of the ruling dynasty. It had to inform and revive the entire world, saving it from its fall. And this was deeply believed by these people. Their entire culture revolved around this, right? And we don't talk about it enough. We don't really space across this concept enough, right? It must instead be reacquired. It must instead be reevaluated. Today we didn't talk too much about Eastern Francia per se. We talk also a lot about Lothair. We talked about other things. So I'm not sure I'm going to insert this in the Eastern Frankish playlist per se, about which we have an astonishing 37 videos, except, of course, most of these derive from the fact that from later German history, as basically a bit like France, it's not until a certain point in history that the Germans start calling their kingdom of Germany as opposed to kingdom of the Eastern Franks, right? So, but we have actually a lot of Eastern Frankish history that we recently made properly in Carolingian times, 1 to at least also the 10th century, right? So again, there's plenty of stuff, and it's really interesting to see how far we've come with German history. We should talk a bit more about later German history. Later medieval German history is a problem also with the other countries a bit, that we don't talk so much in depth about the later Middle Ages, if not maybe for some historical regional series episode. So again, it's a bit difficult to look at sometimes to find the actual info. Again, but I think that this suffices, and I don't know. Again, I'm planning to create something like, I don't know, some interactive map on some site or something to allow you to, if anything, look at how much we made about specific regions and how sort of how much we can look at this stuff across the centuries in a comparative way. I'm, by the way, happy that through the top fixed comments, we can finally have very selective type of video suggestion, meaning that we have so many videos now that we can easily isolate single regions at certain times and properly pointing to those for each video, so that it becomes, even the suggestions become an ever more personalized, customized experience on the basis of the video and what you want to watch, right? So I'm really glad of that, and again, I don't know how much of an impression it actually makes, but we're glad, if anything, to be covering specific regions in this way, and again, that's all good in this fashion. What else to say? Well, for today, I actually stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.